I remember the exact moment I realized my family had already started spending my money while I was still alive. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in my own living room. The kind of slow afternoon when the sunlight comes through the windows just right and the house smells faintly like coffee and lemon polish. My son Daniel was sitting on the couch scrolling through something on his phone, and my daughter-in-law Lindsay stood in the doorway of the kitchen with her arms folded, looking around the house in a way that didn't feel like admiration anymore. Felt like inspection. "You know," she said casually, her voice light and almost cheerful, "this place would look amazing if we opened up that wall and put in bigger windows." I smiled politely because that's what I've always done. I've always been the kind of woman who keeps the peace at the table. But what she said next was the moment something inside me shifted. She laughed softly and added, "Well, I guess one day it'll all be Daniel's anyway, so we might as well start thinking ahead." Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't even look up. He just nodded like she had stated the weather forecast. And in that quiet little moment, sitting in the house that my late husband and I had paid for over 32 years of early mornings, overtime shifts and careful budgeting, I realized something that made my chest feel strangely calm instead of angry. They weren't waiting for the future anymore. In their minds, the future had already arrived. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things I had ignored before. Lindsay talking about our house when she spoke to her friends on the phone. Daniel asking subtle questions about bank accounts and insurance policies. One afternoon, I even heard Lindsay joking in the kitchen while she thought I was upstairs. "Honestly," she said, laughing, "Margaret has more saved than most people our age. We'd be crazy not to plan ahead." I remember standing at the top of the staircase listening to that sentence echo through the hallway. I didn't storm down the stairs. I didn't confront anyone. That's not my style. I simply went back into my bedroom, sat down by the window, and looked out at the oak tree my husband planted the year we moved in. That tree was taller than the roof now. Time has a way of revealing people slowly, like fog lifting off a quiet lake in the morning. And that was the moment I made a very simple decision. If my family wanted to plan for my future, then I would make sure the future was planned very carefully. Because if there's one thing you learn after 67 years of life, it's that patience can be far more powerful than anger. So I smiled at dinner that night. I listened politely when Lindsay talked about renovation ideas again. I even nodded when Daniel joked that I should make sure my paperwork was organized just in case. They thought they were guiding the conversation. They thought they were gently steering me toward the outcome they wanted. What they didn't realize was that I had already begun making arrangements of my own. And before long, they were going to get exactly what they had been asking for. I did not say anything about what I had heard that afternoon on the staircase, and I certainly did not confront Lindsay or Daniel about the way they had started talking about my life like it was already a finished chapter. Instead, I began doing something much quieter. I started watching. When you live with people long enough, you learn their habits the same way you learn the creaks in an old house. Daniel had always been a good boy when he was young, the kind of son who held the door open and helped carry groceries. But somewhere along the road of adulthood, something had changed. It was not sudden, and that was the part that bothered me the most. Changes that happen slowly often go unnoticed until they are impossible to ignore. One evening about 2 weeks after that conversation in the living room, we were all sitting around the kitchen table after dinner. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background while Lindsay scrolled through photos on her tablet. She turned the screen toward Daniel with a bright smile and said, "Look at this kitchen remodel. Imagine how much space we would have if the cabinets were lighter." Daniel leaned closer and nodded like he was already standing in a renovated room. Then Lindsay glanced at me and added with a cheerful voice that sounded almost polite, "Of course, it is just an idea for the future." The future. That word kept appearing in their conversations like a small flag planted in the ground. The future of the house. The future of the savings. The future of everything my late husband Thomas and I had built together. I noticed something else too. Lindsay had started telling little stories about me when her friends visited. They were not cruel stories, not on the surface. But there was always a certain tone, the kind that made a person sound fragile or outdated. One afternoon while pouring lemonade for 2 of her friends on the back patio, she laughed and said, "Margaret still writes checks for half her bills. I keep telling her she should let Daniel handle the finances one day." The friends chuckled politely. I smiled as well because smiling costs nothing. But inside my mind I was taking careful notes. The truth is that I had handled our family finances for nearly 40 years. I knew exactly where every dollar had come from and where every dollar was going. I also knew something Daniel and Lindsay did not realize. They believed they understood my situation because they could see the house, the car in the driveway, and the quiet routine of my days. But there were details they had never asked about, and I had never volunteered them. One morning not long after that patio conversation, I woke up earlier than usual and made myself a cup of coffee while the house was still quiet. The sun had barely started rising when I sat down at the kitchen table with a small notepad. I wrote down one name in neat letters: Robert Hayes. He had been the family attorney for many years, the same man who helped Thomas and me organize our paperwork after retirement. I looked at that name for a moment and then reached for the telephone. The call itself was simple. I asked if he had time to meet sometime that week. His voice sounded warm and familiar when he answered, and he said he would be happy to see me on Thursday morning. I thanked him and hung up the phone slowly. In the hallway I could hear Daniel and Lindsay beginning to move around upstairs, their footsteps faint against the ceiling. They still believed they were planning the future. What they did not understand was that the future had just started moving in a direction they would never expect. I arrived at Robert Hayes's office on Thursday morning 10 minutes early, which is a habit I picked up after decades of believing that punctuality is a form of respect. His office sat on the second floor of a quiet brick building just off Main Street, the same building where Thomas and I had once signed the paperwork for our retirement plan many years ago. Walking through that front door again felt strangely familiar, like stepping back into a chapter of life that had never truly closed. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked if I would like coffee while I waited. I declined and instead sat by the window where the sunlight warmed the wooden floor. Outside, people moved along the sidewalk carrying briefcases and paper cups, busy with their own lives and their own plans for the future. A few minutes later, Robert stepped out of his office and greeted me warmly, shaking my hand with the same calm professionalism I remembered. He had a little more gray in his hair than the last time I saw him, but his voice still carried the steady confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime helping families sort through complicated decisions. He invited me inside and closed the door gently behind us. His office smelled faintly of paper and leather folders, the quiet scent of organized lives written into legal documents. He asked how I had been since Thomas passed away, and I answered honestly that life had been quiet but manageable. Then he leaned back in his chair and asked what had brought me in. I paused for a moment because the words mattered. I did not want to sound angry or emotional. Anger fades quickly, but decisions written on paper tend to last much longer. So I folded my hands on the desk and explained that I wanted to review my estate plan and make a few adjustments. Robert nodded slowly and reached for a folder with my name on it. As he opened it, he began reviewing the documents Thomas and I had signed years earlier. The house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio we had built over decades of careful planning. Everything had originally been arranged in a very traditional way, designed to pass along to Daniel eventually. Robert looked up and asked gently if something had changed. I smiled a little and said that nothing had changed overnight, but sometimes people learn new things about the future when they listen closely to the present. I explained that Daniel and Lindsay had recently become very interested in discussing what would happen to my property someday. Robert raised an eyebrow but did not interrupt. Lawyers are good listeners when they sense an important story is unfolding. I continued by telling him that I wanted to make sure my wishes were extremely clear, so that there would be no confusion later. He asked a few careful questions, writing notes on a yellow legal pad while I spoke. By the time our conversation ended nearly an hour later, several new pages of instructions had been outlined. Robert placed the pen down slowly and looked at me with a thoughtful expression. He said that what I was proposing was completely legal but also quite unusual. I nodded calmly and told him that unusual situations sometimes require creative solutions. As I stood to leave, he assured me that the revised documents would be prepared soon, and that everything would remain confidential until I decided otherwise. Walking back to my car in the parking lot, I felt a quiet sense of relief settle in my chest. Daniel and Lindsay still believed they were carefully planning the future they wanted. What they did not realize was that the future had just been written in a way they would never see coming. I returned home from the meeting with Robert Hayes just before noon, and the house looked exactly the same as it had every day for the past 15 years. but somehow I felt as though I had stepped back into it with new eyes. Lindsay was standing at the kitchen counter with her phone pressed between her shoulder and her ear, talking cheerfully to someone while slicing apples on a cutting board. She waved politely when she noticed me, but her conversation did not stop. I could hear her saying something about cabinet colors and countertop materials, describing ideas with the enthusiasm of someone already imagining the final result. I placed my purse on the chair and quietly poured myself a glass of water while she continued speaking. After she hung up, she smiled and asked how my morning had been. I told her it had been pleasant and that I had taken care of a few errands in town. That was not entirely untrue. Over the next several days I began noticing how confidently Lindsay moved through the house, measuring walls with a small tape measure she had started keeping in the kitchen drawer, and pointing out things she believed could be improved. One evening she stood in the hallway with Daniel discussing where a larger bookshelf could go if the living room were rearranged. Daniel nodded thoughtfully while looking around the room that Thomas and I had furnished piece by piece over the years. I sat quietly in my armchair and listened. It was fascinating to observe how comfortable they had become with their assumptions. About a week later during dinner, Lindsay brought up the subject directly for the first time. She set her fork down and said with a friendly smile that she had been thinking about the future again. She explained that sometimes it was easier for families when everything was clearly organized ahead of time, especially when it came to houses and savings accounts. Daniel agreed and added that planning early prevented confusion later. I looked at both of them for a moment before responding. Then I smiled in a way that seemed to relax them immediately. I told them they were absolutely right and that organizing things ahead of time was a very responsible idea. Their expressions brightened the moment they heard those words. Lindsay even leaned forward slightly, clearly encouraged. That was when I said something else that made them even more comfortable. I told them that I had actually been thinking about the same subject recently, and that I intended to make sure everything was arranged properly, so that everyone would understand exactly what they were receiving one day. Daniel looked relieved and Lindsay laughed softly as if a small worry had just been removed from her mind. She said that was wonderful to hear, and that clear planning made everything easier for families. I nodded calmly and took another sip of water. Inside my mind I thought about the neat stack of papers Robert Hayes had promised to prepare soon. Those papers would describe the future very clearly indeed. Over the next few days Daniel and Lindsay became noticeably more relaxed around me, almost cheerful. They believed the conversation had gone exactly the way they had hoped. They thought I had finally accepted the idea that everything would soon pass neatly into their hands. What they did not understand was that I had agreed with them in the most literal way possible. I truly was going to give them exactly what they had been asking for, and when the time came for those documents to be read out loud in Robert Hayes's quiet office, every single word would make perfect sense. I could almost see the sense of victory settling over Daniel and Lindsay during the weeks that followed that dinner conversation. There is a certain kind of confidence people develop when they believe the outcome is already guaranteed. Lindsay began speaking about the future with an ease that felt almost rehearsed, as though she had finally been given permission to imagine everything the way she wanted it. One Saturday morning she stood in the backyard with Daniel, holding a notepad and sketching ideas while they talked about adding a small patio extension behind the house. I sat by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching them through the glass as they pointed toward the fence and measured the distance with long strides across the grass. That yard had once been Thomas's favorite project. I remembered the summer he planted the oak tree near the corner of the property, carefully digging the hole himself even though the July sun had pushed the temperature past 90 degrees. He used to say that trees were promises you made to the future. Looking out at that same tree now, tall and steady after so many years, I could not help but smile at the quiet irony of the moment. Daniel and Lindsay believed they were planning the future of this place, but the future had already been decided in a very different room across town. A few days later Lindsay brought up the subject again during breakfast. She slid a brochure across the table showing modern kitchen designs with bright lighting and wide countertops. She spoke enthusiastically about how wonderful it would be to refresh the house one day, so that it would feel more open and modern. Daniel nodded along, occasionally glancing at me as though waiting for my approval. I simply listened and told them their ideas sounded very thoughtful. That seemed to encourage them even more. Over time their conversations became less cautious. Lindsay once joked that she would finally have space for the large dining table she had always wanted. Another evening Daniel mentioned that a larger garage might be useful someday. They spoke with the relaxed confidence of people who believed their plans were already halfway complete. What fascinated me the most was how certain they seemed that I would never notice the assumptions hidden inside those conversations. But when you reach my age, you learn that silence can be the most powerful tool in any room. I continued going about my daily routine exactly as before. I watered the plants on the porch every morning. I drove into town for groceries on Wednesdays. I even listened patiently when Lindsay described renovation ideas with cheerful enthusiasm. The only difference was that every so often I received a brief phone call from Robert Hayes. Each call lasted only a few minutes, just long enough for him to confirm another detail about the documents we were preparing. One afternoon he informed me that everything was nearly finalized, and that the paperwork would soon be ready for official signatures. I thanked him calmly and told him I appreciated the careful work. After I hung up the phone I sat quietly for a moment, looking around the living room where Daniel and Lindsay were already discussing paint colors for the walls. They were imagining the future as though it belonged entirely to them. What they did not realize was that soon we would all be sitting together in Robert Hayes's office, and when those papers were finally read aloud, every assumption they had made would be tested by a single, very carefully written sentence. About 3 weeks after my last meeting with Robert Hayes, he called me early on a Tuesday morning while I was watering the plants on the front porch. The autumn air had begun to cool slightly, and a gentle breeze moved through the oak tree Thomas planted all those years ago. When I answered the phone, Robert's calm voice greeted me the same way it always had. He told me that everything was ready. The documents had been finalized, reviewed carefully, and placed into the official file. All that remained now was a formal reading, so that everyone involved would clearly understand the arrangements. I thanked him and asked when he thought that meeting should happen. He suggested the following Friday morning at 10 o'clock. I agreed immediately. After I ended the call, I stood quietly for a moment, listening to the distant sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. It felt like an ordinary morning, yet I knew something important was about to take place. Later that evening during dinner I decided it was time to share the news. Daniel and Lindsay were both sitting across from me at the table, finishing the last of the pot roast I had prepared. The conversation had been light and casual, mostly about work schedules and a new restaurant that had opened downtown. When there was a natural pause, I folded my napkin neatly and said that I had spoken with Robert Hayes earlier that day. Both of them looked up immediately. I explained that I had finished organizing my legal paperwork, and that Robert had suggested a meeting at his office so everything could be explained clearly. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, and I could see a flicker of curiosity in his expression. Lindsay's reaction was even more noticeable. Her eyes brightened in a way she tried to hide behind a polite smile. She asked gently when the meeting would be. I told them it would be Friday morning at 10 o'clock, and that Robert had encouraged everyone involved to attend, so there would be no confusion about anything in the future. Daniel nodded slowly and said that sounded reasonable. Lindsay quickly agreed and added that it was always better for families to handle these things openly and responsibly. The relief in her voice was almost impossible to miss. For the rest of the evening the atmosphere around the table felt strangely upbeat. Daniel even joked that lawyers always made things sound more complicated than they really were. Lindsay laughed and said that by Friday everything would probably feel much clearer. I simply smiled and cleared the dishes as I always did after dinner. Over the next few days I noticed an unmistakable sense of anticipation building in the house. Lindsay spent more time discussing future plans with Daniel, speaking confidently about what could be done once everything was officially settled. Daniel seemed relaxed as well, moving through the house with the easy attitude of someone who believed the path ahead was already prepared. I continued my routine exactly as before, taking quiet walks in the neighborhood and reading in the evenings. Friday morning arrived with bright sunlight and clear skies. When Daniel and Lindsay came downstairs dressed neatly for the meeting, both of them seemed calm and almost cheerful. As we drove across town toward Robert Hayes's office, the car filled with small talk about traffic and the weather. Yet beneath that ordinary conversation, I could feel their quiet expectation growing stronger with every mile. They believed they already knew what the future held for them. What they did not realize was that the most important moment of that future was waiting just a few blocks ahead. inside a quiet office where a single sentence would soon change everything they thought they understood. Robert Hayes's office was exactly the way I remembered it when we arrived that Friday morning, quiet and orderly, with the same soft light coming through the tall windows that faced the street. The receptionist greeted us politely and asked us to take a seat while Robert finished another brief appointment. Daniel sat beside me in the waiting area while Lindsay chose the chair across from us, crossing her legs and glancing around the room with a kind of controlled excitement she was trying not to show too openly. There are certain moments when people believe they are standing at the beginning of a reward they have been waiting for, and that was the feeling in the air that morning. Daniel checked his watch once or twice, but he did not seem impatient. If anything, he seemed relaxed. Lindsay leaned closer to him and whispered something that made them both smile quietly. I simply sat there with my hands folded in my lap, observing the room the way I had many years ago when Thomas and I first walked into this same office to sign our retirement papers. The walls were lined with framed certificates and shelves filled with thick legal books. Everything about the place suggested careful thought and precise language. After a few minutes, the receptionist stood and said that Mr. Hayes was ready to see us. We followed her down the short hallway to the same office where I had met Robert several weeks earlier. He greeted each of us warmly and gestured for us to sit around the large wooden table in the center of the room. Daniel chose the chair beside me while Lindsay sat directly across from Robert. I noticed the neat folder placed on the table in front of him. Inside that folder were the pages we had discussed during our earlier meeting, each one carefully prepared and reviewed. Robert began by thanking everyone for coming and explaining that the purpose of the meeting was simply to make sure my wishes were clearly understood, so there would be no uncertainty in the future. His tone was calm and professional, the same tone he had used for decades when guiding families through important decisions. Daniel nodded politely and said he appreciated the opportunity to hear everything explained properly. Lindsay smiled in agreement, adding that clarity was always helpful for families planning ahead. Robert acknowledged their comments and then opened the folder slowly, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the first page. For a moment the room became very quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside the window. I watched Daniel lean back slightly in his chair, his expression calm and confident. Lindsay sat upright with her hands folded neatly on the table, her eyes fixed on the papers in front of Robert as though she were already imagining the outcome. Robert began reading the document in a steady voice, outlining the basic information that appeared in every legal will. Names, dates, addresses, formal statements confirming that the document represented my official instructions. Daniel listened politely while Lindsay nodded along as if everything sounded exactly as she had expected. Several minutes passed while Robert continued through the opening sections. The atmosphere in the room remained calm and almost routine, the way legal meetings often feel when everyone believes they understand what is coming next. Then Robert turned to the next page, paused for a brief moment, and adjusted the paper in front of him. His expression changed slightly as his eyes moved across a particular line of text. I noticed the pause immediately, although Daniel and Lindsay had not yet realized anything unusual had happened. Robert cleared his throat gently and prepared to read the next sentence aloud, and in that quiet instant before he spoke, the entire future Daniel and Lindsay had imagined was about to encounter a detail they had never even considered. Robert Hayes paused for just a moment before continuing, and although the silence lasted only a second or two, it was long enough for me to notice the slight change in his expression. Daniel did not notice anything unusual yet. He was still, leaning comfortably back in his chair, his arms resting loosely on the armrests as though this meeting were simply another routine step toward the future he had already imagined. Lindsay, however, leaned slightly forward across the table, her attention fixed carefully on the papers in Robert's hands. She seemed eager, the way someone looks when they expect to hear good news confirmed out loud. Robert adjusted his glasses and read the next sentence slowly and clearly, the same calm professional tone he had used since the beginning of the meeting. He explained that all assets listed in the document, including the house, the savings accounts, and the investment portfolio, were indeed designated for transfer to Daniel Whitmore as the primary heir. The words sounded exactly like what Daniel and Lindsay had expected to hear. I saw Lindsay's shoulders relax immediately, and Daniel nodded once with quiet satisfaction. For a brief moment the atmosphere in the room softened, almost like the feeling after a question has been answered exactly the way someone hoped. But Robert was not finished reading that sentence. After a short pause he continued, his voice steady and precise as he read the final portion of the clause. He explained that the transfer of those assets would occur only under one clearly stated condition, written directly into the will. Daniel leaned forward slightly now, his curiosity finally beginning to replace his earlier confidence. Lindsay's smile faded just a little as she waited for the rest of the sentence. Robert continued reading, explaining that Daniel Whitmore would receive full ownership of the house, the land, and all financial assets only after successfully maintaining sole financial and residential responsibility for the property for a continuous period of 10 years without selling, transferring, or placing the property under shared ownership with any other individual. The words settled into the quiet office like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. For a moment nobody spoke. Daniel blinked once and glanced toward Lindsay as though silently asking if he had heard correctly. Lindsay straightened in her chair, her expression slowly shifting from confidence to confusion as she processed the meaning of the condition. Robert calmly finished reading the sentence and placed the page gently on the table. The rule was simple and very clear. The property could not be sold. It could not be shared. And it could not be controlled by anyone except Daniel alone for an entire decade. I remained seated quietly beside my son, my hands folded in my lap exactly the way they had been since the meeting began. The silence that followed was not dramatic or loud, but it carried a weight that filled the entire room. Daniel finally spoke, his voice careful as he asked Robert to clarify what that condition meant in practical terms. Robert explained politely that it meant Daniel would need to personally maintain the home, pay every expense related to it, and keep the property entirely in his own name for 10 consecutive years before the inheritance would become permanent and unrestricted. Lindsay's eyes moved slowly toward Daniel as that explanation settled into place. The confident future she had been imagining now looked very different. And in that quiet moment, for the first time since we had entered the office, both of them began to realize that the future they had planned so carefully was not quite the one waiting for them after all. For several seconds after Robert Hayes finished explaining the condition, the room remained so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the hallway outside his office. Daniel was still looking at the document on the table, as though the words might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. Lindsay was the first to break the silence, although her voice sounded very different from the confident tone she had carried into the meeting earlier that morning. She asked Robert if he could repeat the condition one more time slowly, just to make sure everyone understood it correctly. Robert nodded politely and summarized the clause again with the same calm clarity. Daniel would receive the house, the land, and every listed financial asset exactly as described, but only if he personally maintained full responsibility for the property for 10 consecutive years without selling it, without transferring ownership, and without placing anyone else's name on the title. Every expense related to the house would need to be paid by him alone during that time, including taxes, maintenance, and insurance. Only after those 10 years were successfully completed would the inheritance become permanent and unrestricted. Lindsay leaned back in her chair and exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. It was a small moment, but I could see the calculations beginning to move across their expressions. The house required constant care, and the property taxes alone had increased steadily over the years. The responsibility Robert had just described was not a simple gift waiting to be collected. It was a commitment that required patience, discipline, and personal effort for a full decade. Daniel finally cleared his throat and asked Robert whether the condition could be changed later if circumstances became difficult. Robert answered gently that the document represented my clear instructions, and that any changes would require my direct decision while I was still alive. Daniel turned slowly toward me then, his expression uncertain in a way I had not seen since he was a young boy trying to understand a complicated rule. Lindsay remained quiet, her eyes moving between Daniel and the papers on the table, as though the future she had imagined was slowly shifting into a shape she had not expected. I looked at both of them calmly and spoke in the same steady voice I had used throughout the meeting. I told them that they had both spent a great deal of time discussing the future of the house and the property. They had shared many ideas about what they wanted to do with it someday. I explained that I had simply listened to those conversations very carefully. Then I added that it seemed only fair to make sure they received exactly what they had been planning for all along. Daniel said nothing for a moment, but the meaning of the condition was clearly settling into place now. The house was still there for him, just as he had expected. The land and the savings were still listed in his name. The only difference was that the future they had imagined would now require something they had never talked about before. Responsibility. Robert closed the folder gently and asked if there were any final questions. Neither Daniel nor Lindsay answered right away. The excitement they had carried into the office that morning had disappeared, replaced by a thoughtful silence that felt much more realistic than the confidence they had shown before. As we stood to leave, I glanced once more at the papers resting on the table. The future had not been taken away from them at all. I had simply made sure that if they truly wanted it, they would have to earn it with the same patience and care that had built it in the first place.